I'll share. Okay. Ooh. All right. Here we are. So, as I mentioned, psychology grew out of a branch of philosophy, trying to understand human nature and what we're all about. And there are certain classical problems that psychology tended to inherit when we went into a scientific field. I want to make this clear is in this part of the lecture, I'm giving a very simplified version of these arguments and these ideas and these philosophies. And so if any of these really interest you, I'd encourage you to do the deep dive because it is a lot more complex than what I'm able to lecture on as far as each of these problems are concerned. And the other thing that I would like to note is even though we're looking at this from a Western perspective and Western history kind of thing, we have not found a society that has not wondered about these questions. Or a culture that hasn't wondered about these questions. In fact, at the end of this, we will look at an Otham philosophy about the mind, body, nature, nurture, these types of topics. So, um, just want to keep that in mind as we move forward, as these problems are also, we'll find, not completely resolved. Okay. So let's start with the first philosophical problem, and that is the nature versus nurture problem. Um, the nature nurture problem is the idea is are we born with our intellectual capacity, our personality, who we are as a individual, or are we a product of our experience? Okay. So the nature is who we are on the pure end is what we're inherited with. What is our genetics? And our genetics therefore determines our personality, our intelligence level, and all of those things. Okay. Versus nurture, which is the idea that it's experience that determines much of who we are as people, not our bloodline or our genetics. Okay, and so if we go back to individuals that are known to kind of have debated this issue, is two of who what are known as Socrates students, Plato and Aristotle. So, to give a little bit of perspective, Socrates was probably one of the big names in the Greek world as far as philosophical problems and whatnot. And if you're going to go be an attorney when you're in law school, you'll spend a lot of time in front of your professor or in front of another student doing what's called the Socratic method. Okay. What Socrates believed is if you want to know the ultimate truth, you kind of get with someone and you ask each other's questions, answer, question, answer, question, answer, until you no longer can ask any more questions. That finally the answer becomes the ultimate solution to whatever problem that you have. And that's kind of what they teach in law school because you want to prove, for example, if you're the prosecutor, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person is guilty. If you're the defense attorney, you want to prove your client's defense. So you want to push and question until you come to is this person guilty or not guilty? Okay, so that's kind of the idea behind the Socratic method. Now, when Socrates died, Plato and Aristotle both thought that Socrates would leave the school to one of them. Okay. But in the end, Socrates left his school to Plato, and Aristotle, after a little bit of time, said no more of this and left. And left that and went to eventually develop his own school. Okay. But Plato but because of this split, Plato and Aristotle are going to come to two different conclusions on the nature nurture problem. Okay. Plato, because he stayed established in the school he was in and he kept his status as a aristocratic type of educator, those kinds of things. Plato's going to look at the world and he's going to recognize, especially back then. Now we have some mobility today, but back then a person was born into their trade and lifestyle. So if you were born to a merchant, you're going to become a merchant. If you were born a farmer, you'd be a farmer. If you were born a business person, and the like, and leader class, all of those things you tended to be born into. Okay. And so he's going to theorize because each of those occupations takes a certain type of personality to do well, that the successful people are born with that personality. They're born with that blood. They're born with those genetics. Okay. And this is going to have a profound impact on especially Western history, where we get to the aristocrats, the kings and queens who believe that in order to keep their ruling class, that their kids had to marry royalty, and they had to keep that bloodline as royal as possible. And similarly with any of the other middle classes or mid class, you didn't see very much um, uh, between class marriage. Okay. Uh, and so, uh, so that's going to be Plato's argument. And today, he would very much be in the camp of genetics, that genetics can explain most, if not all, of human experience. Okay. Aristotle, on the other hand, before he went and established his other school, after he left Socrates, he actually went and did a lot of nature observation. In fact, he's noted to being the father of naturalistic science. He established a method of classifying plants and animals, and all of these. And he was very much a naturist, as far as who he was. And he spent years just in nature, observing nature, classifying nature, all of those kinds of things. And the thing that he's going to recognize is that if, for example, a plant doesn't get the right amount of the right soil, the right amount of water, the right amount of sun, that it fails to thrive. It does not do really, really well. But when something is put in just the right natural setting with just the right amount of things that it needs, it tends to be very successful and thrive very well. So, unlike Plato, what he's going to argue is that it's nurture, it's experience, it's what we're born as far as the environment that determines a person's personality and intelligence levels, and even beyond that, health and well-being and all of those kinds of things. Okay. So this is the nurture. So in one way, if you believe that you have this soul that contains your personality, that transcends us and whatnot, you're more on the nature end of things. If you feel it's brain processes, genetics, it's more on the nature kind of things. If you believe things like education is important, life experience is important, all of those things, you're more on the nurture end. Again, even with our refined science and genetics today, we're still pondering this question. We still don't have a good, solid grasp about how much of us is our nature versus our nurture. Okay. And just a quick example we'll get to later in the class when we talk about personality. So, personality traits like extroversion versus introversion, openness versus closedness, um, and whatnot. There's five of them. Can't think of them all right now. Your emotional expression, all of those things. We use something called the genetic quotient, using different scientific methodologies, twin studies, those kinds of things that give us a percentage of how much is probably due to genetics and nature versus how much is nurture and the environment. Okay. And this is where things get complicated in the field of psychology and genetics is dependent upon the study you read, you can get a varied percentage. Some studies are around 20% is genetics, and let's see, that would make 80% environment. Other studies show 60% is due to genetics and nature, and 40% are due to experience. So point being is even with our modern technologies and stuff, we haven't gotten refined enough to really say this is because of genetics versus this is due to experience, because it really is determined upon the study, how the study was designed, how it was done. So this is why this is one of those things that still is up for debate. I will say that most psychologists and most even geneticists and biologists are 90% sure that it's an interaction between the two. Genetics plays a role, your life experience plays a role, and it's somehow a combination. But which one is contributing more or less really is still kind of up for debate. Okay. The second problem that psychology kind of has taken on is what's known as the mind-body problem. Okay. The mind-body problem comes down to, is your mind separate from your physical body? Okay. This is what's called dualism. Okay. Or is your mind and body one of the same? This is called monoistic or materialism. Okay. So two separate things, one and the same. And we're going to look at two philosophers who, again, are going to come to different perspectives on this. Descartes, interestingly, was commissioned by the uh, Holy Catholic, Roman Holy Catholic Church. I'm not saying that right. To really investigate and determine this problem. Descartes at that time was one of the most thought after philosophers. So they're like, let's use Descartes and really finally answer this question so we can, of course, prove the divinity of God, soul, those kinds of things, which you can guess what influences Descartes' conclusion about the mind-body problem based on some pressures he probably had. Okay. So he really went out originally because he didn't want his head cut off to show that the mind and the body were separate from each other. Okay. And he did this while this is kind of like the apple falling on um, Newton's head kind of idea. That's probably a little bit of an exaggeration. But he came up with his simple explanation of dualism when he was walking through some gardens in Germany. At the time, there were gardens with statues. And if you stepped on a rock, some hydraulics would start to play in the statue, and the statue would start to move. because you stepped on that rock. Okay. And he argued that this is proof that the mind and the body are separate because he argued that a physical thing cannot act in and of itself. It needs something to act upon it. Okay. So our bodies just aren't going to start animating themselves without some mind or soul that is operating on it. Okay. So he came up with dualism that it's a necessity to have a mind in order for the physical body to operate. Okay. Interestingly, he put the seat of the mind in the pituitary gland, which is probably not the place of the mind. But anyways, all right. So that was Descartes, and that's kind of some of the first kind of arguments in at least modern philosophy that the mind and body are two separate things. Okay. Now, John Locke, an English philosopher, is going to come to a very different perspective. Um, if Thomas Jefferson would have submitted the Declaration of Independence to my class as an assignment, I'd actually have to do a plagiarism report on him and send him to the dean's office. Okay. Reason being is that a good portion of the Declaration of Independence were taken directly from John Locke's treatise on government. Because what Locke wanted to prove is that we're all born equal and therefore have the same rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those were Locke's terms, not actually Jefferson's terms. Okay. But how is it from a philosophical perspective that we're all born equal? How can that be? Well, if you take away the assumption that you're born already with your soul and your mind and your personality and your intelligence, then no, we can't be born equal. Okay. Because some people are going to be more emotionally controlled than others. Some are going to be more intelligent, less intelligent, based upon their soul that they had when they came into this world. So what Locke is going to do to even, according to him, even the playing field is he's going to say, well, the reason we're all born equal is because we're all born with blank slates for which experience writes upon. If I were to put this in modern terms, it would be we are all born with blank hard drives for which we then use and build and experience fills that hard drive. Okay. Um, and so that's what creates equality. And with that, Locke argued we can't have a mind that is separate from the body because then we're not all born equal. Okay. So this is what's called materialism, the monistic view. But let's fast forward to modern times. Okay. Now, with the advent of modern MRIs, CAT scans, and stuff like that, a lot of psychologists and neurologists are sliding more towards the materialistic view that we are just these organic brains in action. Okay. Um, and that we don't really have this extra entity that is necessary for the body to exist because they point when you damage or you block certain parts of the brain, that functioning goes away. If you had a mind, there would be a workaround. The mind would figure it out and it shouldn't inhibit your behavior or mental process. So that's kind of the argument. The issue is, and why this is still a very much debated question, is that um, while the brain does explain a lot, and I think I may have already stated this in this class before, it doesn't explain everything. Like, for example, we know the brain is probably a CPU, okay? But how that CPU goes from electrical activity to us being able to see the visual area and experience that. For auditory electrical information, then be to give us the sense, the perception of sound. We don't know how the brain does that. We don't know how the brain creates the images that we see and experience. We don't know how the brain actually makes us feel something if it's a purely physiological sensation that we're supposed to be feeling. Why is that necessary for us to do it if the brain already knows what it's going to do? Okay. And so there's a lot of things about neuroscience, about the brain and whatnot that we purely just do not understand. And so there's this room for the idea still that the mind and the body do have some separate operations. However, they're much more closely entwined with each other that I don't think we'll ever see a pure dualistic approach, but more of an integrated approach between the mind and the body. Okay. And we'll come back to both of these debates as we look at different topics throughout the class. But that's kind of just as a preview, kind of where we are today. Okay. All right. Let me see. Let me make sure. Okay. So, one of the last philosophical problems that psychology has tried to understand is what was known as the nature of man. Are we born selfish, aggressive, self-gratifying, quote unquote evil? I'm just going to simplify by using that term. Or are we born altruistic, helping, social, adaptive, okay, or good? So evil versus good. Just in using those terms as placeholders for what I just described. Okay. Well, again, we can look at two philosophers. And one reason I like these philosophers is they're going to have a huge influence on modern government systems, as we'll get to kind of see which philosophy are we. Okay. So again, Hobbes and Rousseau, they're going to do very much what other philosophers are going to do, and they're going to look at nature as a way of determining what our nature is, because especially during the period these folks were around, we very much had a naturalistic philosophy that there's no separation between humans and nature. We're all one and the same. Okay. So Hobbes is going to look at nature and he's going to see all of its destructive forces. He's going to see hurricanes destroying land and property, and volcanoes blowing up mountains, and prey eating um, predators eating their prey. And he's gonna interpret this as nature is naturally destructive, is naturally aggressive, is naturally self inhibiting, in self-promoting, and therefore that is the nature of humans, that we're the same destructively. Okay. Rousseau's going to look at that, and he's gonna see the destruction and stuff, but he's going to see it very differently. He's going to see that a volcano creates more land. A wildfire creates more nutrients for better growth. The predator eats the prey. The predator then defecates, which fertilizes the ground for which the prey is eating upon. So there's this symbolic or this reciprocal relationship between these opposite species, that they rely on each other. Um, He's going to see that there's more helping within species than there is aggression. And so he's going to argue that people's natural tendency is towards good, towards helping through altruism and those types of things. Okay. All right. As I mentioned, so what Rousseau's going to argue, though, is that a person becomes bad or evil when they deviate from nature. That it's when you lose your sense of who you are and your place in this world is when you have the tendency to become self-centered, egotistical, self-serving, and don't really care about others and their well-being. Okay. So, as I mentioned, Hobbes and Rousseau are going to have influences on our modern government system. Hobbes is going to have a huge influence on American and British government systems. Rousseau's going to have a huge influence on the Baltic states, um, 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 Switzerland. Oh, I can't remember them. Switzerland, those countries there, the Denmark, those kinds of countries. Okay. What people in the Americas, at least Western America, the United States government and the British government is they're going then to use Hobbes' idea to say that people's natural tendencies are towards evil, crime, all those kinds of things. So it's the job of the government to keep control of the people's behavior. Because if the people are left alone without rules and without laws, they will naturally go to their natural state of aggression and whatnot. So our legal systems are very much based upon that. It's based on a punishment system. It's based on a banishment system where those evil people, we put them somewhere else and we treat them uh, awful so that we hope that they will come to this realization that they can't act the way they're acting or they'll have to continue existing in this jail cell or this prison cell or in this awful place because it's our job as a government and society to temper your natural aggressive tendencies. And that's very much the legal system that we have. Okay. However, when we look at Denmark, Switzerland, the Baltic states, they're going to take Rousseau's idea and they're going to say it's the job of government to bring individuals who do something back into the community and give them a purpose and a place to be. And so many of the prisons, for example, in Denmark and whatnot, are like going to a Hilton here in the United States. Very comfortable rooms. They can come and go as they please through their dorm rooms. They have therapies. They have even massage therapies. They have places that people can go interact and act together and be together. And the idea is it's bringing them back to a community, a sense of place, a sense of purpose, and whatnot. Okay. So this argument is going to get a lot more complicated as we move through this class. But one way we can kind of look at um, what is maybe the nature of man based on comparing these two different countries' viewpoints about evilness. Okay. Well, we could look at things like recidivism rate. Okay. And when I talk about recidivism, that is the probability that a person will go back to jail or prison after being released their first time. Okay. So, what is that percentage? What is that probability? All right. And if you're really, here in the United States and stuff, and you look at what they're doing in the Baltic and Denmark and Switzerland, you would assume that they have a really high recidivism rate because look what you'd have to go to here in the United States If I'm going to go to a luxury place for a while and hang out and get three squares and all those things, I'd have no problem committing more crime. However, that's not what comes out statistically. The recidivism rate here in the United States is 60%. Okay. Meaning that you have a little bit greater than chance rate of going back to prison after you've been in there for the first time. Okay. In again, the Baltic states and whatnot, the recidivism rate is around 10%. Okay. Meaning that you have around a 90% chance of never going back to jail or prison again. Okay. And so when we look at this, we can see, well, there's some argument that when we treat people good, they do good. And when we treat people bad, they do bad. But I'm going to put a big but here. It's going to get very complicated as we move through this class. It's just not a simple treat people good, they'll be good, treat people bad, they'll be bad. The world is a very much more complicated than that. And that's why this topic will be a very common topic we'll go throughout the rest of this class. Okay? What time are we? Okay. So those are the three philosophies that we often talk about. Some broader theories. Oh, wait, I did want to mention, because I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, that it's not just Western societies and Western philosophy that have asked these questions. If we go to every culture that we've studied so far, there's still cultures out there we haven't. All of them have a different philosophy or similar philosophy or idea about how these things interact. Okay. And I'm going to give one example from he's passed away, so he's a couple years ago. He's greatly missed, but I'm going to give a philosophy by Camillus Lopez. He was a professor here at TOCC. He was a respected storyteller and elder on the Otham Nation. And the reason why I like bringing him up is it also brings up the diversity of philosophies, even within a single Native American nation like the Tana Otham. Because while he developed this philosophy, not all people on the Tohono Nation necessarily agree with it. Okay. And so this is an example, but please, the thing that I would encourage you to do is not to think that this broadly represent all of Tana Otham. This is just one philosopher elder's interpretation. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer before we went in here. So this is what Camillus said, okay? And he used his interpretation of different uh, stories, creation stories, and all of those things about the Tanatham people to kind of come up with this philosophy, okay? He's going to say that people have a duplicity in life. We have the potential to do good and we have the potential to do evil dependent on what is necessary in that situation for us to deal with it. Okay. And he's going to use, according to Camillus, the story of the Bon or the coyote in English. Okay. And he's going to note that in traditional stories about the Bon is that he was both devious, meaning he liked getting trouble started. He was a trickster. Okay. But when a community got in trouble or a community was having a really hard time, he also would go in and try and help the community become better again or healthy again. Okay. So he had this dual nature of both a trickster and a helper. Okay. He's going to argue that we actually have three aspects. It's just not the mind, the body. Okay. He argued that we have a physical body, which is what's necessary to navigate the world we're living in. And he argued that we have a mind, but we also have a soul and spirit. The mind is all of our collective knowledge that is necessary for us to exist in this world. Okay. And he's going to argue that the mind and the body actually only exist in this earthly world, that the mind does not supersede or go on. He's going to argue we have a soul and a spirit that supersedes um, both the mind and the body. So we don't take what we learned here, we take the essence in a way. Okay. Now, I am not in any way expert on Tanahatham history, so I would I would encourage you to kind of remember this kind of philosophy when you're in your history class and they're talking about traditional burials, traditional funerals in the Tanahatham nation, because he used his interpretation of those to develop this mind, body, and then soul separations. So, but I'm in no way capable of explaining that appropriately. So I will just say that's where it came from in his philosophy. So this is just an example of one native person's understanding of their stories that they've heard growing up and their interpretation of the nature of individuals, the mind-body problem, and all of those things. So um, just as an example. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to get into the different theories and stuff. But I think what we'll do today is we will finish up with some overall theories that have been used to explain human nature and whatnot. And then we'll get into some specific psychological theories, excuse me, this coming Thursday. So let me just give an overview of what would be called what is known as a meta theory. Meta theories are theories that explain overall um, um, data and observations that we make. Okay. And probably one of the more popular ones, especially in modern times in psychology, and I would argue biology, genetics, all of those different fields, is the theory of evolution, uh, which was popularized. I shouldn't say it was invented or it was because that would be a misnomer, but was popularized by the work of Charles Darwin. Okay. Um, what he's going to argue in what was known as his Origins of Species is that species evolve over time. And we know that everything has the potential of going from simple to complex. I hear this all the time, or I actually think about it all the time, about how simple things used to be when I was a child. Life seems so much more simple, but for some reason it's so much more complex as an adult and as I age. This is kind of a example of that. We have this natural tendency to go from simple to complex organisms. Okay. And that we do this to adapt to a given environment. Because what Darwin did is he went along the islands and he noticed that the beaks of the same species of birds could be different based upon the food sources that were available in that region. Okay. And he's going to call this natural selection, that the environment selects those traits that encourage the continuation of that species, which then results into adaptation. Okay. Um, Now, he's going to later on do a more controversial statement about the nature of man in his book, Descent of Man. Okay. Um, so he specifically wanted to talk about human evolution, but if you want to think about what the roots of modern genetic science is, It really starts with the Descent of Man of Charles Darwin, because he's going to argue that we have common ancestries, both within our own species and between other animals. So genetically, we are 99% genetic similar to a bonobo monkey, compared to, let's say, genetically similar to our dogs or cats. Okay. So we have these very common roots. Now, one misnomer is, did we evolve from monkeys? The answer to that question is we evolved with monkeys. We didn't go from being monkeys to human beings. It's kind of a false assumption of what Darwin was trying to say. Okay, is he would argue that we come from similar species outlined, but the demands put upon us differentiated us through the eons. Okay. I do want to talk about, because he did mention natural selection, that the environment selects certain things out. And this comes with what's known as survival of the fittest, that only the fittest of a species survives and moves on. Okay. This is something that I always feel like needs clarification. Charles Darwin never used the term survival of the fittest. Okay. This was used later by a social evolutionist, who wanted to prove that things like eugenics is appropriate if we're going to get the fittest humans around. This is going to be the justification that Hitler's going to use for the elimination of the Jews during World War II. Okay. But Charles Darwin never said that only the fittest survive. In fact, if we look at nature, sometimes it's not what you think the fittest would exist. Okay. And so I just want to clarify that, because a lot of people criticize Darwin for that statement, or some people use it to support their ideology. But he actually ever never even termed that. He wasn't the person that wrote that. Just wanted to bring that up really quick. But so what does this theory kind of help us explain? Well, it has been used in social neuroscience to explain our huge social brain that we have. Um, uh, the if we were to compare our brain with other social animals like ants and bees and stuff like that, they have an oversized part of the brain that processes social information, and so do we. And he's going to argue that, evolution took the bet of us being a social being instead of an isolated being. And we will see as we move along the strong evidence towards that. Okay. But right now, evolutionary theory is kind of what's used to explain, those different tendencies of human beings. Okay. So, and then let's finish with two other ideas, and then we'll be done for today, gang. I think you're probably tired of hearing me talk, so I'm going to finish with these two other things. I want to talk about Wilhelm Wundt and William James. Okay, Wilhelm Wundt is considered the father of modern psychology. Okay, while this is up to debate, the reason that he is considered the father of modern psychology is he was one of the first to establish a scientific lab at a university, I believe it was in Germany, to do inquiries into the mind. Okay. So he's kind of the architect, if you would say, or the father of what we would consider modern psychology. William James, I'll kind of flip back and forth, would be considered kind of the father of purely United States American psychology. Okay. He was one of the first to lecture on the topic. This Principles of Psychology right here is going to be the first textbooks textbook we use in psychology classes here in the United States. In fact, if you go on to your master's and doctorate degree, I promise you will read both volumes of that book. Um, and so he developed, though, between him and Wundt, we're going to get two different flavors of what the purpose of psychology should be. So I'm going to go back to Wilhelm Wundt. So the two things that he did do that were important for psychology is, we'll start at the bottom. He did establish that we could use experimental methods to study the mind, okay, which kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of research and whatnot everywhere. He used a method called introspection, okay. Introspection is when a way he felt you could study consciousness by having the participants just purely describe their thoughts, feelings, and sensation in detail. In one of the introspective methods is you flip a color, a card. So you flip yellow and you ask, uh, what does that make you feel? And the thing you ask the participant is, don't filter your answer. What immediately comes to your mind when you see that yellow color? What immediately comes to mind when you see red? Okay. What immediately comes to mind when you hear the word spouse or arrogant or happy? Okay. And what Wundt thought is, by collecting all of the different responses over and over and over, that we would come to this common thing that so every human should emotionally experience yellow the same, or the word spouse the same, yet for common psychological processes. Introspection, I will say, is something that is still used, especially in things like clinical and counseling psychology, as a way of investigating a way a person is feeling, thinking, and acting. As a scientific technique, it didn't pan out very well. If you look at the research on the connection between color and emotions, it would take up almost an entire library room because of the different results that have been collected over the years that contradict with each other. So, as a method of trying to find common psychological processes, it didn't work out very well. Okay. Now, one of the things that it is going to establish is something known as structuralism. Okay. What Wundt felt is that in order to understand the mind and the body and behavior, we have to break the mental processes into their most basic elements and structures. Okay. I'm going to put structuralism in a simple term. You notice that the amygdala starts to become very active in the brain when when someone is watching something they should fear or are scared of. It lights up like a Roman candle in the MRI. Okay. And so you conclude that fear is the result of the amygdala's activity, and that explains fear. That's structuralism, because you're just saying, as long as I know what structure is involved, I know that that's what that is. That fear is a neural response to a stimulus. Okay. So that's going to be structuralism. And one of our first structuralist theories that we'll look at is Sigmund Freud's, because he's going to break the mind into different components such as the id, the ego, the superego, and those kinds of things. So that will be one of our first structuralist theories we'll look at starting this coming Thursday. Wilhelm Wundt is going to do a very American thing. Is he's going to say, if you think about, the United States, we kind of like to know how things work. What is their purpose? What is their utility? And so James is going to develop a school of thought called functionalism, okay, where he's going to say, I really don't care if the amygdala becomes active when someone is experiencing fear. I want to know why that person is experiencing fear and what purpose it has. Okay. So instead of just looking at the structure, he wants to know what the function is. Okay. What is its purpose? Why do we even experience it in the first place? All right. And again, as we go through this class, we will see that a lot of things will talk about the structure. So we'll always be talking about brain processes, those kinds of things. But we're also going to talk about what their function is. What is the purpose of feeling happiness or sadness or all those kinds of things? Okay. Um, and so that's kind of where we'll be heading. We'll get to this stream of consciousness and this James Lange theory at another time. But where we're going to head this coming Thursday is we're going to look at some of the different, more specific theories that have been developed in psychology that kind of gives us a flavor of how psychologists try to understand our behavior and mental processes based upon, I hope, this structure that we've been providing. Okay, so I hope that didn't put anyone asleep, but let me stop our recording.